Should you use JSON Web Tokens for auth? Usually, no. No is the answer right here. We've got on the screen, Henrik Blautz says, no, do not use these tokens for your auth. And there's a very good reason, usually because you're going to need a few sets of features that you want to leverage that JWTs make it very difficult or not necessary altogether. Now, obviously, we need some justification here. I'm going to scroll down to the list. Here's your checklist. There is a checklist here to go through to see if any of these apply to you. Then don't use JWT, I think. All right, let's start off. All right, so you want to implement a logout. All right, so if there's a button you want to click, you want to implement a logout. JWT is a long-lived token, and you could have the client sort of forget the token. So essentially the client's logged out. The token is still valid. So from a security perspective, you haven't really destroyed the token. So that's one. Do you want to log out? You need to be able to block users. So if you have a bad actor, you need to expire their token immediately. Well, that's one of the flags that you need to check to see if that you would need a database for something like that. If, for example, you need additional information with the JWT, usually the JWT will include all the information you typically need for the user inside the JWT itself, right? The entire token has everything it needs. However, if there's more data and you need to leverage it based on the token, this is another checkbox. Do you fit that model? Now, this last one I'm a little suspect on. It says, does your service do anything with the data in the database at all? So if you hit the database on each request, for example, which means that, hey, you're already hitting the database anyway, does that same database have a session? Now, essentially, if you said yes to any of these, according to Henrik, you should not use tokens, JWT tokens, JSON Web Tokens, because you'll be hitting a database. The whole point of a JWT is for efficiency and scale. The idea is that you can generate a token, pass it off to the user, and that token is now available to be used based on the permissions that have been granted, and it doesn't need to access any other data. All other systems kind of know, based on the token itself, what information lies inside of it. So if you need to access the database anyway, according to this, you won't necessarily gain the benefit, right? The benefit of a JWT is significant performance and scale. You don't need to access the database if you've already got the JWT ready to go. What is JWT? That sounds like it's complicated and a little bit involved. JSON Web Token. Well, it's related to security, and there are some steps to get it to work properly. The good news is the whole focus around JWT is that it provides all the data for the application embedded into the token itself with an added layer of security and authenticity. The good part is this is really intended for high-scale systems and efficient systems. If you want your application to go faster, make sure to use a JWT. You will enter an anti-pattern. The whole point of asking the question, should you use a JWT for authentication, is if you can get by without having to re-access the database, right? Or for your auth layer. That will dramatically reduce every single API call in terms of a performance perspective. Is a major performance hit. So better user experience overall, take advantage of JWT, which has a really well-designed standard for authenticated tokens. Now, the big deal on this is that the big players, Google and Facebook, they like these because they have a lot of users, and a JWT is really going to get them that much further because it's going to cost them a lot less money. Additionally, it's a significant improvement on the user experience. Now, let's take a look at what a JWT really looks like. You've got three parts here. We've got the header, payload, and a signature. So the signature is the security aspect that validates that this came from a trusted source on a secure code execution environment, which is a server, right? The API endpoint, like Facebook and Google, they have servers. And right here, the secret is kept secret, and it never gets transmitted anywhere other than Google's and Facebook's secret server, for example, or your own API, right? Your API server will have the secret, and no one gets to have that secret. The idea is it starts off with the spec. The very first item is it's JSON, right? So you've got a JSON payload here, and it's base64 encoded. So you see number 1 here and number 1, this is the header. It's going to tell you what kind of token this is, right? So we say JWT. JWT is a type of token, and the algorithm that's going to be used to sign it, right, which says HS256 which is going to be a HMAC SHA 256, and then it follows this pattern here. So this is the header. It's going to give it instructions. The payload section, you can have anything you want in here, absolutely anything. That's really exciting. You can have a name, you can have other data, you can have location data, everything their app needs could go in here. Obviously you don't want it too big, but you also want to make sure that you put enough in there that any information that's going to be used between pages or sessions will get stored there. And an extra item would be expiration time, because these tokens, by default, they don't expire. You need to check to see if the token has a date that's associated with sort of like a time to live, right? A TTL. If there's a date on it, and every time that your server receives a JWT from the user, it validates it through a signature. And the great part is it can do this without having to access any disk or data or cache system. Essentially, it pulls in the data, it reads it from the end user in a header through the request. It validates by taking the payload. Here's the algorithm. So we take the header data, which is the JSON. What kind of encryption are we going to use here? Then we take the payload, which is your user data, basically anything you want in here. And then we base64 encode both of these things. We put a period in the middle. And then we HMAC SHA-256, which is a cryptographic SHA, right? So it's a secure hashing algorithm, including our secret. And this will create an item that looks like this here on line number 3. Now you'll notice that line number 1, which is in blue, and line number 3 here, which is in red, these are going to be relatively static in size, right? They're going to have a fixed length, and they're always going to sort of look like that. The green, number 2, the payload, that can get really big. That can get a lot longer because you can put more data in there, and that's the whole point. You want to put all the caching data that you want inside this payload section. That's it. It's pretty simple, right? The great part is it's all just algorithmic. It can all execute on the secure your server API endpoint, right? And this is the algorithm part right here, step 3, the signature. Everything else is just kind of, do as you go. And the end user, when you're dealing with a client on, say, a mobile phone or a web browser, all the client has to do is know this string. It's just going to be a string, right? Just a simple string. It doesn't need to know anything else. And what it gets to do is it can split by the period symbol here, and it can decode this green section and then leverage all the data in here for the application itself, which is really powerful. So now the application itself can take the payload data and then use it to populate the screen, the UI, and any other aspect that the user will be leveraging going forward in the app. The core benefit of a JSON Web Token is its performance and scale. Its capability that allows a vendor or provider to then give a significant boost not only to the performance for the end user, but also from a server cost perspective. The idea is that the core benefit of a JWT, it doesn't need to connect to a user database to verify the authenticity of the token itself due to the nature of how it is implemented. And that means that the issuer can have like dedicated services that manage at scale. Just from a CPU perspective, it only needs to leverage and have access to the secret that signs the data for authenticity, which means that there's no need to access a centralized database. Significant performance improvement. Now, if you have the opportunity, the best you can, you want to provide a really good user experience, and you want a JWT to be able to offer that, because all of your APIs, obviously for the most part, they need to be secure, right? And users need to have access to only the parts that they will have access to, and a JWT will be able to store all that information. What data can the user access? What is the user's name? What is the user's ID? What is the expiration of the token? All that, of course, goes inside the payload section, and you can use that. And it's validated through the signature section here, which means that you can validate, hey, this is a real token. And for example, the end user wouldn't be able to change anything in the payload. If they did, the signature would fail, and you'd know that the end user is trying to take advantage of your API, and so you can block them outright. Now, of course, one of the drawbacks is, if you want to log out session type situation, the token is a one-time generation, and the idea is that it doesn't have a way to check a database to see if it's valid, for example. So one of the strategies that you might want to implement is a short time to live. So if you want to expire the token, you could just kind of do that with an average, say around 5 minutes for the token itself. And then every time the issuer, as it needs, can recreate a new token. And they could use a refresh token approach, which is necessary as the user authenticates with an email password. Typically, that would be required for every time you get a token. However, if you have something called a refresh token, you could leverage that. The problem is now we're getting into more complex scenarios, and if you need something like that, then typically you're gonna have to implement more on the client and more on the server. And now while it works fine, it works okay from a scalability perspective, you kind of are starting to get more tech debt here, and we kind of don't really want to have to do that. One of the other tricks to implement a logout with JWT is to use a caching system rather than a database outright. You could just have an in-memory cache that's distributed and available to all your servers. You would be able to check against this cache. Say if you had a 20-minute time to live JWT, you could first check to see if the token is expired, and if it's not, then check to see if it's been invalidated. Now, this does have an increased cost, which kind of diminishes the returns on the JWT's capability, so you will be spending more money for a logout. However, it could be very useful in your case if you really need to do that, but you still want to gain some of the advantages of JWT from a performance and scalability perspective. Thank you to Henrik Plautz. That was published just here a few days ago on whether we should use JSON Web Tokens. Usually the answer could most often be no, according to Henrik, though, if depending on the trade-offs, you could get pretty close to being able to take as much advantage of JWT's refresh capabilities, and maybe if you need a logout or a session timeout type thing, you can implement those kinds of things as well. So there's just a lot of goodness that you get with a JWT, though most often from an implementation perspective, it can get very tricky. You might want to just stick with regular session IDs that are long and don't include any information at all. They're just a very, very long string that's sort of like a cookie that you pass over to the API. The API does the lookup and manages to make sure that the session is valid from a database table, for example. And in that case, you would be able to do things more real time. It's a little more easily, because if you wanted to, you could expire the token immediately just by writing to the database, versus the extra workarounds that you need with a JWT. We have a couple of comments about JSON Web Tokens in the article, should I use JWTs for auth? And some of the idea here is that we're kind of, the whole point of a JWT is really to mix session management and user data at the same time, because you get to take scales of advantages there. Now, yes, the idea of a JWT is to mix session management and user data, because you want to be able to hand off as much user data as possible to the end target device, so it doesn't need to hit a database, right? If you need to hit a database, now you are running into issues of scalability, you're running into issues of increased cost and performance reductions overall. So for authentication purposes, a refresh token is required with a JWT. It does add complexity. And if you really want to add user data into the token, you have to make sure that all of that's done up front, right? Because you get one time to do that. If the user, for example, changes their data, see, now we've got an interesting scenario. The user changes their name or maybe their email address. The JWT has all that sort of hard-coded in. So what you have to do is regenerate a new token the moment that the user changes any of their information. Otherwise, that will be out of sync from a cache perspective on the client. All right, so there's funny comment here that says the title of it, right? The title of the article, should I use JWT for auth? And it says you should not use JWT. At the end of the article, but at the very beginning, it's an immediate no, right? But then it also lists out whether you should use them or not based on a checklist. And so which one is it really in terms of a titling perspective? No one has ever argued that you absolutely need a JWT. You don't really need it, especially if it's a lower scale system, right? If you don't have to deal with millions of users, you might not necessarily gain an advantage of the performance of JWT, which is significant. One of the real benefits of JWT, and it's exactly, I like the, okay, so I like this article. This mention here is really you should always strive for the broader community standards in general, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel through another session management system. If you can take advantage of JWT, might as well. Hey, guess what? Even if you have to implement some of those checklist items of like, say, hey, I need a logout layout system, then you don't gain the performance of JWT, but you're still in a standard space scenario. So this actually is still okay in that case, right? You might as well use JWT, and if you have to, check a database to see if the user has been expired or evicted or blocked, those sorts of things. All right, Nicola has a good comment here. I like this one. Will be the last comment. JWT kind of goes into the realm, since it's our standards based, it's already available as a library that can parse the token for you automatically on every client, right? So you've got your Android, your iOS, your web clients, any server APIs, you've got your Rust, your Python, any kind of language. It's going to have a JWT parser built in, and you can use that parser to not only consume the tokens, but you can use it to validate the tokens, and you can use it to generate new tokens. So that's one of the good reasons that you should definitely still use JWT, even if your system needs a way to expire those tokens, which negates some of the ability to leverage database-less access control. And in that case, my opinion is definitely always use JWT. Might as well. It's already there. It's already easy. Even if you have to go a step further and access the database, might as well use JWT. It's already written for you.